Real men don't cry. Tough it out. Don't be such a girl. Sound familiar? These aren't just harmless phrases. They're the building blocks of a mental health crisis that's killing men every day. I believed these lies for 28 years of my life until my body and mind simply couldn't take it anymore. Today, I'm showing you what toxic masculinity actually costs and why the strongest thing you can do is reject these outdated ideas about being a man. The hidden prison of toxic masculinity. What if the very traits you thought made you strong were actually breaking you down? The stoicism, the toughness, the emotional control, qualities many of us were taught define manhood, might actually be the very things damaging our mental health. This isn't about attacking masculinity. It's about understanding when healthy traits become harmful expectations. I've noticed in conversations with viewers that there's often immediate defensiveness when the term toxic masculinity comes up. Many men hear it as masculinity is toxic, a sweeping condemnation of male identity. This misunderstanding creates resistance to addressing potentially harmful patterns in our lives. Let me be clear. Traditional masculinity itself isn't the problem. Courage, leadership, and protectiveness are positive traits that don't fall under the toxic umbrella. The real issue is the rigid rule book many of us feel forced to follow. It's not about being a man, it's about the restrictive boundaries that trap us in emotional cages. These unwritten rules dictate that showing vulnerability equals weakness, that we must always be competitive, that we should never ask for help, and that we must reject anything perceived as feminine, including natural emotional responses like sadness, fear, or tenderness. I remember growing up hearing that phrase, "man up," whenever I showed even a hint of vulnerability. By my 20s, I had internalized this message so completely that when I lost my job and fell into depression, I told absolutely no one, not my closest friends, not my family. For 6 months, I pretended everything was fine while internally falling apart. Why? Because I believed that real men handle their problems alone. This self-imposed isolation nearly cost me everything. This is the insidious nature of toxic masculinity. It convinces us that emotional suppression is strength. But there's a critical distinction we need to make between healthy and unhealthy expressions of masculinity. Being stoic in a crisis can be valuable, but stoicism at all costs, never processing emotions, never showing vulnerability, becomes destructive. Similarly, leadership and confidence are admirable, but aggressive dominance and the need to control others crosses into harmful territory. These expectations didn't appear from nowhere. They've been shaped by evolving social and cultural norms throughout history. What's particularly interesting is that today's version of masculinity isn't some timeless truth. It's a relatively recent cultural construction that continues to shift. During certain historical periods, men were expected to be primary providers and protectors, which gradually led to the suppression of vulnerability as a perceived weakness. The messages reinforcing these expectations are everywhere. Think about the action heroes we grew up watching. How many showed emotional depth beyond anger? How many sought help when overwhelmed? In video games, films, and TV shows, men are consistently portrayed as emotionally detached problem solvers who use aggression rather than communication. When male characters do show vulnerability, it's often treated as comedic or as a momentary weakness before returning to stoic strength. This messaging extends beyond media into our everyday interactions. The phrase, "boys will be boys," excuses aggressive behavior while simultaneously shutting down emotional expression. Our peer groups often reward conformity to these norms while punishing deviation. I've watched friend groups mercilessly mock the first guy to admit feeling depressed or anxious, ensuring everyone else keeps their struggles hidden. What's particularly disturbing is how these expectations manifest in behaviors that society often celebrates. Dangerous driving, excessive drinking, physical fighting, all justified as masculine expressions rather than recognized as harmful coping mechanisms for unexpressed emotions. The invisible toll these expectations take accumulates over time. Each suppressed feeling, each vulnerability hidden, each authentic expression denied. They don't disappear. They build up behind increasingly fragile walls, creating pressure that must eventually find release, often in destructive ways. So what does toxic masculinity actually mean? It's not an attack on men or masculinity itself. Rather, it's a specific set of harmful cultural expectations that limit men's emotional expression and help-seeking behaviors. It's the aspects of traditional masculine norms that cause harm to men themselves and those around them. Understanding this distinction is essential for addressing these issues without feeling personally attacked. The emotional collapse. Understanding toxic masculinity isn't just an academic exercise. It's about recognizing a silent crisis that's claiming lives. The emotional suppression that begins in childhood doesn't simply fade away. It transforms into something far more dangerous and unpredictable over time. When young boys hear "stop crying" or "toughen up" repeatedly, they're not just receiving casual instructions. They're undergoing systematic emotional conditioning that rewires their relationship with their own feelings. By adulthood, this suppression becomes so automatic that many men don't even recognize it's happening. What begins as a conscious effort to hide emotions eventually becomes an unconscious inability to identify them at all. This emotional numbness creates what psychologists call a pressure cooker effect. Contrary to popular belief, emotions don't simply disappear when ignored. They intensify and find alternative pathways for expression. The research is clear. Men who internalize their distress experience magnified psychological damage. The emotions don't vanish, they mutate. I experienced this firsthand. For years, I prided myself on my ability to handle anything without showing a crack in my armor. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, I began experiencing debilitating panic attacks during business meetings. I'd excuse myself, lock myself in bathroom stalls, and struggle to breathe while my heart raced uncontrollably. Nighttime brought insomnia as my mind, finally quiet from daily distractions, would flood with overwhelming thoughts. Eventually, I found myself contemplating whether everyone might be better off without me, thoughts that genuinely terrified me because they seemed to come from nowhere. But they didn't come from nowhere. They were the predictable outcome of decades of emotional suppression. The statistics paint a grim picture of this phenomenon. Men die by suicide at a rate 4 times higher than women. Not because men experience more mental health challenges, but because the barriers to seeking help are substantially higher. This isn't coincidental. It's the direct result of masculine norms that equate vulnerability with weakness. The relationship damage is equally severe, but often overlooked. Without the capacity for emotional expression, genuine intimacy becomes nearly impossible. Partners report frustration with emotional walls they can't penetrate. One-sided, emotional. Labor becomes the norm, with women typically carrying the burden of maintaining emotional health for the entire relationship, while men remain disconnected from their own feelings and needs. What many don't realize is that emotional suppression isn't just psychologically harmful, it manifests physically. Research connects long-term emotional suppression to elevated stress hormones that damage cardiovascular health. The constant internal pressure of containing emotions requires physiological effort, activating stress responses that, over time, compromise immune function. The body keeps the score of every emotion we refuse to process. When men turn to coping mechanisms to manage this internal distress, the outcomes are statistically alarming. Approximately 62,000 men die due to alcohol-related causes annually, more than double the 26,000 women who die from the same causes. Men are also 2 to 3 times more likely to misuse drugs than women. These aren't random statistics. They're the measurable consequences of a system that teaches men to numb their pain rather than address it. What makes the situation particularly tragic is that many men interpret these struggles as personal failures rather than predictable outcomes of a harmful system. The very expectations that cause the damage also prevent men from recognizing the source of their suffering. When a man can't sleep, feels anxious, or turns to alcohol to numb his emotions, he's likely to blame himself for not being strong enough, rather than questioning the impossible standards he's trying to meet. The most insidious aspect of toxic masculinity is how it isolates men exactly when connection could save them. In moments of crisis, when reaching out could literally mean the difference between life and death, the voices of "handle it yourself" and "don't be a burden" grow loudest. The same cultural pressures that create the mental health crisis simultaneously block the pathways to recovery. This isn't just about individual struggles, it's about a systematic denial of emotional resources to half the population. Men are taught to suppress emotions, discouraged from seeking support, and then statistically punished with higher suicide rates when those strategies inevitably fail. It's a deadly cycle perpetuated not by personal choices, but by cultural expectations that set men up for psychological damage from the earliest ages. Conclusion. So, what does the path forward look like? The research is clear. Therapy and counseling provide crucial safe spaces where men can explore emotions without judgment and develop healthier coping mechanisms. Many find cognitive behavioral therapy particularly effective for reshaping harmful thought patterns. Support groups offer something equally valuable: connection with others facing similar struggles. This community aspect helps break the isolation that toxic masculinity creates. Educational programs targeting these issues have shown remarkable success, focusing on emotional intelligence and communication skills. Building resilience through stress management techniques and self-care practices completes the picture. The strongest men I know aren't those who never feel, they're those brave enough to face their feelings head on. Share your journey below. Your story matters.